Chapter 9 of The Jewels of Aptor by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Chapter 9. Snake reached down, picked the beads up from Urson's hand. The sound of wings had stopped. "Where do we go now?" Urson asked. "Follow the general rule, I guess," said Iimmi. "Since we know Hama does have a temple somewhere, we try to find it, get the third jewel, and rescue Argo incarnate. Then get back to the ship." "In 3 days?" asked Urson. They had related the rest of what they had found to him by now. "Well, where do we start looking?" "The priestess said something about a band of Hama's disciples behind the fire mountain. That must mean the volcano we saw from the steps in the City of New Hope." Iimmi turned to Snake. "Did you read her mind enough to know if she was telling the truth?" Snake nodded. Iimmi paused for a moment. "Well, since the river is that way, we should head," he turned and pointed, "in that direction." They fixed their stride now and started through the moon-brushed foliage. "I still don't understand what was going on back at the monastery," Geo said. "Were they really priestesses of Argo? And what was Jordde doing?" "I'd say yes on the first question, and guess that Jordde was a spy for them for an answer to the second." "But what about Argo? I mean Argo and the ship?" asked Geo. "And what about Snake here?" "Argo on the ship apparently doesn't know about Argo on Aptor," said Iimmi. "That's what Jordde meant when he reported to the priestesses that she was bewildered. She probably thinks, just like we did, that he's Hama's spy. And this one here," he gestured to Snake, "I don't know. I just don't know." In the distance was a red glow in which they could make out the faint lines of the volcano's cone. Snake made lights with the jewels, and once more they began to pick their way over the terrain, barer and barer of vegetation. The earth became cindery, and the air bore the acrid smell of old ashes. Soon the rim of the crater hung close above them. Iimmi gazed up at the red haze above them. "I wonder what it's like to look into that thing in the middle of the night." 20 feet later, Snake's lights struck a lava cliff that sheered up into the darkness. Going on beside it, they found a ledge that made an 18-inch footpath diagonally up the face. "We're not going to climb that in the dark, are we?" asked Geo. "Better than in the light," said Urson. "This way, you can't see how far you have to fall." 30 feet on, instead of petering out and forcing them to go back, the lip of rock broadened into a level stretch of ground, and again they could go straight forward toward the red light above them. "This is changeable country," Urson muttered. "Men change into animals," said Geo. "Jungles turn to mountains." He reached around and felt the stub of his arm in the dark. "I've changed too, I guess." Iimmi recited. "Change is neither merciful nor just. They say Leonard da Vinci put his trust in faulty paints. Christ's supper turned to dust." "What's that from?" Geo asked. "That's one of my bits of original research," Iimmi explained. "It comes from a poem dating back before the Great Fire." "Who was Leonard da Vinci?" Geo asked. "An artist. Another poet or painter, I suppose," said Iimmi. "But I'm not really sure." "Who's Christ?" Urson asked. "Another god." There were more rocks now, and Geo had to brace his stub against the walls of fissures and hoist himself up with his good hand. The igneous structures were sharp in his palm. Through the night, the glowing rim dropped toward them. With it came a breeze that pushed sulfur powder through their hair and made the edges of their nostrils sting. The earth became scaly and rotten under their feet. Fatigue tied tiny knots high in their guts so that their stomachs hung like stones. "I didn't realize how big the crater was," Iimmi said. The red glow cut off at the bottom and took up a quarter of the sky. "Maybe it'll erupt on us," Urson muttered. He added, "I'm thirsty." They climbed on. Once, Urson looked back and saw Geo had stopped some 20 feet behind them at a niche in the ledge. He turned around and dropped back himself. There was sweat on the boy's upturned face as the big man came toward him. He could see it in the red haze from the rim. "Here," Urson said. "Give me a hand." "I can't," Geo said softly, "or I'll fall." Urson reached down now, caught the boy around the chest, and hoisted him over the cropping of rock. "Take it easy," Urson instructed. "You don't have to race with anybody." Together they made their way after the others. Iimmi and Snake cleared the crater rim first. Then Urson and Geo joined them on the pitted ledge. Together they looked into the volcano as red and yellow light fell over their chests and faces. Gold dribbled the internal slope. Tongues of red rock lapped the sides, and the swirling white basin belched brown blobs of smoke which rose up the far rocks and spilled over the brim a radion away. Light leapt in wavering pylons of blue flame, then sank back into the pit. Winding trails of light webbed the crater's walls, and at places ebon cavities jeweled among the light. Wind fingered the watcher's hair. Iimmi saw her first, 200 feet along the rim. Her drapes, dyed red and orange in the flame, blew about her as she walked toward them. Iimmi pointed to her, and the others looked up. As she neared, Geo saw that though she stood very straight, she was old. Her short white hair snapped at the side of her head in the warm breeze. Firelight and shadow fell deeply into the wrinkles of her face. As she approached them, light running like liquid down the side of her winded robe. She smiled and held out her hand. "Who are you?" Geo suddenly asked. "Shadows melt in light of sacred laughter. Hands and houses shall be one hereafter," recited the woman in a calm, low voice. She paused. "I am Argo incarnate, of Leptar." "But I thought," Iimmi started. "What did you think?" inquired the elderly woman gently. "Nothing," said Iimmi.
"He thought you were a lot younger," Urson said. "We're supposed to take you home."
Suddenly he pointed into the volcano.
"Say, this isn't any of that funny light like back in the city that burned our hands, only this time it made you old."
She glanced at the pool of light. "This is natural fire," she assured them. "A severed artery of the earth's burning blood. But wounds are natural enough." Geo shifted his feet and rubbed his stump. "We were supposed to take the younger sister of the present Argo incarnate and return with her to Leptar," Iimmi explained. "There are many Argos," smiled the woman. "The goddess has many faces. You have seen quite a few since you arrived in this land."
"I guess we have," Urson said.
"Are you a prisoner of Hama?" asked Iimmi. "I am with Hama," said the woman. "We are supposed to secure the third jewel and bring it back to the ship. We don't have much time." "Yes," said Argo.
"Hey, what about that nest of vampires down there?" Urson said, thumbing viciously toward the black behind them. "They said they worshipped Argo. What have you got to do with them? I don't trust anything on this place very much."
"The nature of the goddess is change," said the woman, looking sadly toward the slope. "From birth through life to death." She looked back up at them. to birth again. As I said, Argo has many faces. You must be very tired." "Yes," said Geo. "Then come with me, please." She turned and began to walk back along the rim. Snake and Iimmi started after her, and then came Geo and Urson. "I don't like any of this," the big man whispered to Geo as they came along. "Argo doesn't mean the same thing in this land like she means on Leptar. There's nothing but more evil to come out of this. She's leading us into a trap, I tell you. I say the best thing to do is to take the jewels we have, turn around, and get the hell out of here. I tell you, Geo." "Urson?" Geo said. "Huh?" the big man asked. "Urson, I'm very tired." They walked silently for a few steps more. Then Urson heaved up a half disgusted breath and put his arm around Geo's shoulder. "Come on," he grunted, supporting Geo against his own great form as they progressed along the rocky ledge, following the new Argo. At last she turned down a trail that dropped into the crater. "Walk carefully here," she said as they turned into the huge pit. "Something is not right," Urson said softly. "It's a trap, I tell you. How does that thing go? I could use it now. Calmly, brother bear." "Calm the winter sleep. Fire shall not harm," continued Geo.
"Says who?" mumbled Urson, glancing into the bowl of flame.
Geo went on. "Water not alarm. While the current grows, amber honey flows, golden salmon leap."
"Like I once said before," mused Urson,
"In here," came the voice of Argo. They turned into the dark mouth of one of the caves which pocked the crater's inside wall. "No," she said to Snake, who was about to use the jewels for illumination. "They have been used too much already." With a small stick taken from a pocket in her robe, she struck a flame against the rock, then raised it to an ornate branching candelabra that hung from the stone ceiling by brass chains. Flame leapt from cast oil cup to oil cup, from the hand of a demon to a monkey's mouth, from a nymph's belly to the horns of a satyr's head. Chemicals in the cups caused each flame to burn a different color. Green, red, blue, and orange white light filled the small chapel and played across the tops of the benches. On the altar, sitting on one side of the room, were two statues of equal height, a man sitting and a woman kneeling. Iimmi looked at the altar. Geo and Urson stared at the candelabra. "What is it?" Iimmi asked when he saw where their eyes were fixed. "There's one of those strange things in Argo's cabin on board the ship," Geo said. "And look over there. Where did we see one of those before?" It was a machine with an opaque glass screen, identical to the one in the monastery of Argo. "Sit down," Argo said. "Sit down." They sank to the benches. The climb once halted, knotting their calves and the low muscles on their backs.
"Hama has allowed you the privilege of a chapel even in captivity," commented Iimmi. "But I see you have to share your altar with him."
"But I am Hama's mother," smiled Argo.
Geo and Urson frowned.
"The rituals say that Argo is the mother of all things, the begetter and bearer of all life. I am the mother of all gods as well."
"Those blind women down in the ground," asked Urson, "they aren't really your priestesses, are they? They wanted to kill us. I bet they were really dupes of Hama."
"It isn't so simple," replied Argo. "They are really worshippers of Argo. But, as I said, I have many faces. Death as well as life is my province. The dwellers in that convent from which you escaped are how shall I say? a degenerate branch of the religion. They were truly blinded by the fall of the City of New Hope. To them, Argo is only death, the dominator of men. For not only is Argo the mother of Hama, she is his wife and daughter." "Then it's like we figured," said Iimmi. "Jordde isn't a spy for Hama. He's working for the renegade priestesses of Argo." "Yes," returned Argo, "except that renegade is perhaps the wrong word. They believe that their way is correct, and a respect for belief is essential to the understanding of man, and it is through understanding that the mysteries that still remain in your mind will be solved."
"Then they must be responsible for all that was going on in Leptar, only somehow blaming it on Hama," said Iimmi. "They were probably just after the jewels, too. You don't look like a prisoner. That must be the whole thing. You're here in league with Hama to prevent the priestesses of Argo from taking over Leptar."
"Nothing could be simpler," said the Goddess. "Unfortunately, you are wrong in nearly every other point."
"But then why did Jordde throw the jewel after us when he tore it from I mean the other Argo's throat?"
"When he snatched the jewel from around my daughter's neck," added Argo, "he threw it to the creatures of the sea because he knew they would take it back to Aptor. With it once again in the island, the priestesses would have a better chance of getting it. My daughter, acting Argo incarnate in my absence, and her sisters, does not know that what she is fighting is another face of Argo. As far as she is concerned, all her efforts are against the mischief Hama has caused, and truly caused, in Leptar. This ignorance is far greater than you imagine, for beyond these blind creatures is a far greater enemy that she must vanquish."
"Hama," began Iimmi.
"Greater than Hama," said old Argo. "It is herself. It is hard for me to watch her and not occasionally call out a word of guidance. With the science here in Aptor it would not be difficult, but I must refrain. I suppose she has actually done well, but there is so much more to do. She has directed you well, and assigned your tasks properly, and until now you have carried them out well."
"She said we were to steal the final jewel from Hama and return with you to the ship," said Geo. "Can you help us with either of these things?"
"The moment I compliment you," laughed Argo, "you completely confuse your mission. Once the jewel is stolen, whom are you supposed to take back to Leptar?"
"Argo Incarnate," Urson said.
"You said that Argo back in the ship was your daughter," said Geo. "But she said you were her younger sister." "She said nothing of the sort," Argo corrected. "I have two daughters. You have already met one. Now you must rescue the other. When my youngest daughter was kidnapped here to Aptor, I was already here, waiting for her. Look." She turned a dial beneath the screen, and lights flickered over the glass until they formed a sleeping figure. She had short red hair, a splash of freckles over a blunt nose, and her hand lay curled in a loose fist near her mouth. A white sheet covered the gentle push of adolescent breasts, and on the table beside her bed was a contraption made of a U-shaped piece of metal mounted on a board, an incomplete coil of wire, and a few more bits of metal, all sitting on top of a crumpled paper bag. "That is my youngest daughter," Argo said, switching off the picture. "She is the one you must take back to the ship."
"How shall we steal the jewel?" asked Geo.
Argo turned to Snake. "I believe that was your task. Then she looked around at the other three. You will need rest. After that you can see about the jewel and my daughter. Come with me, now. Pallets have been set up for you in the far room where you may sleep." She rose and led them to a further chamber. The blankets over the loose boughs seemed to pull them down. Argo pointed to a trickle of water that ran from a basin carved in the rock wall. "This stream is pure. You may drink from it." She pointed to a cloth sack in the corner. "There is fruit in there if you become hungry." "Sleep," said Urson, jammed his two fists in the air, and yawned. As they settled, Argo said, "Poet?" "Yes," answered Geo. "I know you are the tiredest, but I must talk to you alone for a moment or two." As Geo raised himself, Urson stood up too. "Look," he said to Argo. "He needs the rest more than any of us. If you want to question him about rituals and spells, take Iimmi. He knows just as much as Geo." "I need a poet," smiled Argo, "not a student. I need one who has suffered as he has. Come." "Wait," Urson said. He picked the jewel from Geo's chest to where Snake had returned it when they entered the chapel. "You better leave this with me." Geo frowned. "It still may be a trap," said Urson. "Leave it with him," suggested Argo, "if it eases him." Geo let the great hand lift the thong from his neck. "Now come with me," said Argo. They left the room and walked back through the chapel to the door. Argo stood in the entrance, looking down at the molten rock. The light sifted through her robe, leaving the darker outline of her body. Without turning, she began to speak. "The fire is a splendid symbol for life. Do you agree?" "And for death," said Geo. "One of Aptor's fires burned my arm away." "Yes." She turned now. "You and Snake have had the hardest time. Both of you have left your flesh to rot in Aptor. I guess that gives you a closeness to the land." She paused. "You know, he had a great deal more pain than you. Do you know how he lost his tongue? I watched it all from this same screen inside the chapel and could not help. They jammed their knuckles in his jaws, and when the mouth came open, Jordde caught the red flesh with pincers that closed all the way through, and stretched it out as far as it would go. Then he looped the tongue with a thin wire, and then he threw a switch. You do not know what electricity is, do you?" "I have heard the word." "Let me just say that when a great deal of it is passed through a thin wire, the wire becomes very hot, white hot. And the white hot loop was tautened until the rope of muscle seared away and just the roasted stump was left. But the child had fainted already. I wonder if the young can really bear more pain than older people." "Jordde and the blind priestess did that to him?" "Jordde and some men on the boat that picked up the two of them from the raft on which they had left Aptor." "Who is Jordde?" Geo asked. "Urson knew him before this as a first mate, but Urson's story told me nothing." "I know the story," Argo said, "and it tells you something. But something you would perhaps rather not know." She sighed. "Poet, how well do you know yourself?" "What do you mean?" Geo asked. "How well do you know the workings of a man? How he manages to function? That is what you will sing of if your songs are to become great." "I still don't." "I have a question for you, a poetic riddle. Will you try to answer it?" "If you will answer a not too poetic riddle for me." "Will you do your best to answer mine?" Argo asked. "Yes." "Then I will do my best to answer yours. What is your question?" "Who is Jordde And why is he doing what he's doing? He was at one time, Argo explained, a very promising novice for the priesthood of Argo and Leptar, as well as a scholar of myths and rituals like Iimmi and yourself. He also took to the sea to learn of the world. But his boat was wrecked, and he and a few others were cast on Aptor's shore. They strove with Aptor's terrors, as you did, and many succumbed. Two, however, a four-armed cabin boy, whom you call Snake, and Jordde, were each exposed to the forces of Argo and Hama, as you have been. One, in his strangeness, could see into men's minds. The other could not. Silently, one swore allegiance to one force, while one swore allegiance to the other. The second part of your question was, why? Perhaps if you can answer my riddle, you can answer that part yourself. I do know that they were the only two who escaped. I do know that Snake would not tell Jordde his choice, and that Jordde tried to convince the child to follow him. When they were rescued, I know that the argument continued, and that Snake held back with childish tenacity both his decision and his ability to read minds, even under the hot wire and the pincers. The hot wire, incidentally, was something Jordde brought with him from the blind priestesses, according to him, to help the people of Leptar with. It could have been a great use, but recently all he has done with the electricity is construct a larger weapon with it. However, Jordde became a staunch first mate in a year's time. Snake became a waterfront thief. Both waited. Then, when the opportunity arose, both acted. Why? Perhaps you can tell me, poet. Thank you for telling me what you know, Geo said. What is your question? She glanced at the flame through the door once more, and then recited. By the dark chamber sits its twin, where the body's floods begin, and the two are twinned again, turning out and turning in. In the bright chamber runs the line of the division, silver fine, diminishing along the lanes of memory to an inward sign. Fear floods in the turning room. Love breaks in the burning dome. It is not one that I have heard before, Geo said. I'm not even sure I know what the question is. I'm familiar with neither its diction nor style. I doubted very much that you would recognize it, smiled Argo. Is it part of the pre-purge rituals of Argo? It was written by my youngest daughter, Argo said. The question is, can you explain it? Oh, said Geo. I didn't realize. He paused. By the dark chamber sits its twin, moving in and out, and that's where the floods of the body begin. And it's twinned again. The heart, he suggested? The four-chambered human heart? That's where the body's flood begins. I think that will do for part of the answer. The bright chamber, mused Geo. The burning dome. The human mind, I guess. The line of division running down the lane of memory. I'm not sure. You seem to be doing fairly well. Could it refer to something like the two sides of every question? Geo asked. Or something similar? It could, Argo said, though I must confess I hadn't thought of it in that way. But it is the last two lines that puzzle me. Fear floods in the turning room, repeated Geo. Love breaks in the burning dome. I guess that's the mind and the heart again. You usually think of love with the heart and fear with the mind. Maybe she meant that they both, the heart and the mind, have control over both love and fear. Perhaps she did, Argo smiled. You must ask her, when you rescue her from the clutches of Hama. Before turning back to the room with his companions, he looked once more out at the fires of the volcano. Light whirled white and red. Blue tongues licked at black rock siding. He turned away now and went back into the darkness. End of chapter 9. Of The Jewels of Aptor by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 10. Dawn light lay aslant the crater's ridge. Argo pointed down the opposite slope. A black temple was visible at the bottom, among trees and lawns. "There is Hama's temple," Argo said. "You have your task. Good luck." They started down the incline of cinders. It took them an hour to reach the first trees that surrounded the dark buildings and the great gardens. Entering on the first lip of grass, they heard a sudden cluster of notes from one of the trees. "A bird," Iimmi said. "I haven't heard one of those since I left Leptar." Suddenly, bright blue and the length of a man's forefinger, a lizard ran halfway down the trunk of the tree. Its sapphire belly heaved in the early light, with indrawn breath. Then it opened its red mouth, its throat warbled, and there was another burst of music. "Oh well," said Iimmi. "I was close." They walked further, until Iimmi mused. "I wonder why you always think things are going to turn out like you expect." "Because when something sounds like that," declared Urson, "it usually is a bird." Suddenly he gave a little shiver. "Lizards," he said. "It was a pretty lizard," said Iimmi. "Going around expecting things to be what they seem can get you in trouble, especially on this island," Geo commented. The angle at which they walked made one of the clumps of tree before them seem to fall apart. A man standing in the center raised his hand and said briskly, "Stop." They stopped. He wore dark robes, and his short white hair made a close helmet above his brown face. Urson's hand was on his sword. Snake stood with his feet wide, his hands out from his sides. "Who are you?" the dark man declared. "Who are you?" Urson parried. "I am Hama incarnate." They were silent. Finally Geo said, "We are travelers in Aptor. We don't mean any harm." As the man moved forward, splotches of light from the trees slipped across his robe. "Come with me," Hama said. He turned and proceeded among the trees. They followed. They passed into the temple garden. It was early enough in the morning so that the sunlight lapped pink tongues over the giant black urns that sat along the edges of the path. Now they passed into the temple. As they passed, Hama turned, looked at the jewels on Iimmi's and Geo's necks, and then looked up at the gazing eye of the statue at the end of the altar. He made no other sign, but turned again and continued. "The morning rites have not yet started," he said. "They will begin in a half an hour. By then I hope to have divined your purpose in coming here." At the other side of the stairway they mounted a stairway, and then entered a door above which was a black circle dotted with three eyes. Just as they were about to go in, Geo looked around, frowned, and caught Iimmi's eye. "Snake?" he mouthed. Iimmi looked around and shrugged. The man turned and faced them, apparently unaware of Snake's departure. As he closed the door, now, he said, "You have come to oppose the forces of Aptor, am I right? You come to steal the jewel of Hama. You have come to kidnap the incarnate Argo. Is that not your purpose? Keep your hand off your sword, Urson. I can kill you in a moment. You are defenseless." "Damn, I'm sleepy." She rolled over and cuddled the pillow. Then she opened her eyes, one at a time. and lay watching the nearly completed motor of metal bars and copper wire that sat on the table beside her bed. She stood up. Then she collapsed on the bed and jammed her feet under the covers again. With 30 feet of 1½ inch brass pipe, she mused sleepily, I could carry heat from the main hot water line under the floor, which I would estimate to be about the proper surface area to keep these stones warm. Let me see. 30 feet of 1½ inch pipe have a surface area of 22/7 times 3/2 times 30, which is 990 divided by 7, which is. Then she caught herself. Damn, you're thinking about this to avoid thinking about getting up. She opened her eyes once more, put feet on the stone, and held them there while she stretched vigorously at her uneven mop of red hair. She looked at the clock. Yikes, she said softly, and ran out the door, and slammed it behind her, almost. She whirled around, caught it on her palms before it banged shut, and then closed it with gingerly care, the final centimeter and a half of the arc. Are you trying to get caught? She asked herself as she tiptoed to the next door. She opened it and looked in. Dunderhead looks cute when he's asleep, she thought. There was a cord on the floor that ran from under the table by the priest's bed, over the stones, carefully following the zigzag of the crevices between them, and at last the end lay in the corner of the door sill. You really couldn't see it if you weren't looking for it, which had more or less been the idea when she had put it there last night, before the priest had come back from vespers. The far end was tied in a knot of her own invention to the electric plug of his alarm clock. Dunderhead had an annoying habit of resetting his clock every evening, making sure that the red second hand was still sweeping away the minutes. In her plans for this morning she had catalogued his every habitual action, and had observed this one for 3 nights running, hanging upside down from the bulky stone portcullis above and outside his window. Tugging on this string, she saw it leap from the crevices into a straight line, and then lift from the floor as she drew it tauter, and then go slack as the plug blipped quietly onto the floor. Next, she pulled the string again until the slack left, and raised her end a few inches from the floor. With her free hand now she gave the string a small twit and watched the vibration run up and down the string twice. The knot's invention was an ingenious one. At the vibration, 2 opposed loops shook away from a third, and a 4 millimeter length of rubber band that had been sewn in tautened and released a 4th loop from around a small length of No. 4 gauge wire with a holding tonsure of 3/4 of a gram, and the opposing vibration returning up the thread loosed a similar apparatus on the other side of the plug. The knot fell away, and she wound it quickly around her hand. She stood up, closed the door, and the oiled lock was perfectly silent. The doorknob was just the slightest bit greasy, she noted. Careless. Back in her room, it was standing on the table. Sunlight from the high window fell red across the board. It was very early in the morning. She took the parts of the motor up in her hands. I guess we try you out today, no? She answered herself. Yes. Finally she put the parts in the paper bag, strode out of the room, and slammed the whirled around and caught it once more. She said. Do you want to get caught? For the second time she answered herself. Yes. And remember that too, or you'll never get through it. As she walked down the hall she heard through one of the windows the chirp of a blue lizard from the garden. The sound I wanted to hear, she smiled to herself. A good sign. Turning into the temple, she started down the side aisle. The great black columns passed before her. Something moved between the columns along the other side, swift and indistinct as a bird's shadow. At least she thought she saw something. Remember, she reminded herself, you have guilt feelings about this whole thing, and you could very easily be manufacturing delusions to scare yourself out of going through with it. She went on, passed two more columns, and saw it again. Or, she went on with her monologue, you could be purposefully ignoring the very obvious fact that there is somebody over there who is going to see you. So watch it. There were mirrors somewhere in the temple, but they weren't on the opposite wall, so she couldn't be seeing herself. In fact, the mirrors were out in the vestibule through which she had come, and maybe this other person had come, so maybe it was seeing her as a reflection of. Unscramble that syntax, she told herself. You think like that and you'll never make it. But there was somebody, with no clothes on, for all practical purposes, sneaking between the pillars. And he had 4 arms! That made her start to think of something else, but the thought, as it arrowed into the past, suddenly got deflected, turned completely about and jammed into her brain again, because he was staring directly at her. If he starts walking toward me, she thought, I'm going to be scared out of my ears, so I better start walking toward him. Besides, I want to see what he looks like. She started out from the columns. Glancing quickly both ways, she saw that the temple was deserted, save for them. He's a kid, she thought, 3/4 of the way across. My age, she added, and again a foreign thought attempted to intrude itself on her, but never made it, because he was coming toward her now. At last he stopped before her, silent, muscles like tight wire under the brown skin, black hair massing low on his forehead, his eyes deep beneath the black shrub of brows. She gulped and asked him, "What are you doing here? Do you know somebody could catch you here and get mad as hell? I know I couldn't possibly have, but I think I've seen you before someplace. If somebody comes along, they might even think you were trying to steal Hama's eye." I shouldn't have said that, she thought, because he moved funny. You better get out of here, because everybody will be up here in a half an hour for morning services. At that news he suddenly darted forward, passed her, and sprinted down toward the altar. "Hey!" she called, and ran after him. Snake vaulted over the brass altar rail. "Wait a minute," she called, catching up. "Wait! Will you?" Snake turned as she slung her leg across the brass bar. "Look, I realize I gave away my hand, but that was only guilt feelings. You gave yours away too, though, and if you don't think you've got guilt feelings, boy, you're crazy." Snake frowned, tilted his head, and then grinned. "So we'll help each other, see?" she said. "You want it too, don't you?" She pointed up to the head of the statue towering above them. "So let's cooperate. I'll get it for a little while, then you can have it." He was listening, she saw, so she guessed her strategy was working. Play it by ear now, she thought. "We'll help each other. Shake on it, huh?" She stuck out her hand. All 4 hands reached forward. "Whoops," she thought. "I hope he's not offended." But the 4 hands grasped hers, and she added her second to the juncture. "All right," she said. "Come on. Now I had all this figured out last night, and we don't have much time. Let's go around." But he walked over to where the stalks of wheat spired from the altar base up through Hama's fist, and grabbed a stalk with the 3 hands, and, hand over hand, began to hoist himself up to where the first broad sheets of metal leaves leaned out to form a small platform. At first his dirty feet swung out, frog-like, but then he caught the stem with his toes and at last hoisted himself to the front and looked down at her.
I can't climb up there, she said. I don't have your elevation power. Snake looked down and shrugged. Oh, damn, she said. I'll do it my way. She ran across the altar to the great foot of the statue. Sitting cross-legged, Hama's foot was on his side. Using the ridges made by the toes as steps, she clambered up to the dark bulge of the deity's godlike bunion. She made her way across the ankle, up the slanting shin, back down the black thigh, until she stood at the crevice where the leg and torso meet. Out beyond the great knee, Snake regarded her from his perch in the groin of yellow leaf. They were about equal height. Yoo-hoo, she waved. Meet you at the clavicle. Then she stuck her tongue out. The bulges in the belly of the god made a treacherous ledge along which she inched until she arrived at the cavernous navel, leaving wet handprints on the black stone. The god's belly button from this intimate distance revealed itself as a circular door about 5 feet in diameter and controlled by a combination lock. She missed the first number twice, dried her hands off, and began again. According to the plans in the main safe of the temple, on which she had first practiced combination breaking, there was a ladder behind this door which led up into the statue. She remembered it clearly and saved her life by doing so, because when she caught the second number, reversed the direction, and felt the telltale click of the third, she pulled on the handle and was almost pushed from the ledge by the swinging circular door. She grabbed at a handle that she hardly saw on the doors inside, just as the stone slipped from beneath her feet. Then she was hanging 5 feet out in the air, over the sacred groin, some 50 feet below. The first thing she tried, after closing her eyes and mumbling a few laws of motion, was to swing the door to. When she swung out, however, the door swung closed, and when she swung in, the door swung open. After a while, she just hung. She gave small thanks that she had dried her hands. When her arms began to ache, she wished that she hadn't, because then it would be over by now. She went over what she knew about taking judo falls. Then the door swung closed, and someone grabbed her around the waist. She didn't open her eyes, but she felt her body pressed against the tilting stone. Her arms fell tingling to her sides. The ligaments flamed with pain. Then the pain dulled to throbbing, and she opened her eyes. "How the hell did you get down here?" she asked Snake. With his help, she staggered through the open door and stopped to rub her arms. "How did you know about the ladder?" They were standing in the shaft now, with the ladder beside them, running up into the darkness. He looked at her with a puzzled expression. "What is it?" she asked. "Oh, I'll be able to climb up there. Never you worry. Hey, can you speak?" Snake shook his head. "Oh," she said. Something started at the edge of her mind again. A picture of something unpleasant. Snake had started up the ladder which he had come down so quickly a minute ago. She glanced out the door, stopped, saw that the temple was empty, pulled the door to, and followed. They ascended into complete darkness. Her arms were beginning to ache again, just slightly. She reached up for the next rung and found it in its proper place. Then the next, and then again the next. She started counting steps now, and when 74, 75, and 76 dropped below her, there was a missing rung. She reached above it, but there was none. She ran her hand up the edge of the ladder and found that it suddenly curved into the wall. "Hey, you," she said in the darkness. Something touched her waist. She said, "Don't do that." It touched her on the leg, took hold of her ankle, and pulled. "Watch out," she said. It pulled again. She raised her foot, and it was tugged sideways a good foot and a half and set on solid flooring. Then a hand her foot was not released took her arm, and another held her waist, and tugged. She stiffened for one instant before she remembered the number of limbs her companion had. Then she came off the ladder, sideways into the dark, afraid to put her other foot down lest she step headlong into the 75-foot plus shaft. But he tugged again, and in losing her balance her foot came down on cool, solid stone. Holding her arm now, he led her along the tunnel. They passed into a steep incline. Now down the upper arm, she recalled. "I feel like Eurydice," she said aloud. "You funny," an echoing voice sounded in her skull. "Hey," she said. "What was that?" But the voice was silent. The wall turned abruptly and the floor leveled out. They were in a section of the passage now that corresponded roughly to the statue's radial artery. At the wrist there was a light. They mounted a stairway, came out a trap door, and found themselves standing high in the temple. Below them the great room spread, vastly deep, and still empty. Beside them the stems of the bronze wheat stalks rose up through the fist and spired another 50 feet before breaking into clusters of golden grain and leaves. Across from them, over the dark curve of gargantuan chest, in the statue's other hand, the shaft of the scythe leaned away into shadow. "Look," she said. "You follow me now." She started back along the top of the forearm and then began the tedious climb over the rippling biceps, till at last they reached the broad shoulder. They walked across the hollow above the collarbone until they stood just below the great scooping shell of the ear. She took the paper bag she had stuffed into her belt, tied one end of the string around the neck, and then, holding the other, she heaved the bag up and over the ear. She got the other end of the string, knotted it as high as she could reach, and gave it a tug. "I hope this works," she said. "I had it all figured out yesterday. The tensile strength of this stuff is about 250 pounds, which ought to do for you and me." She planted her foot on the swell of the neck tendon, and in 7 leaps she made it to the lobe of the ear. She swung around into the hollow, using the frontal wing as a pivot. Crouching in the hollow trumpet, she looked down at Snake. "Come up," she said. "Hurry up." Snake joined her a moment later. The ear was hollow too. It led back into a cylindrical chamber which went up through the head of the god. The architect who had designed the statue had conveniently left the god's lid flipped. They climbed the ladder and emerged amid the tangle of pipes which represented the hair of the god. They made their way forward through the mass of pipes to where the forehead sloped dangerously forward. They could see the foreshortened nose and the rim of the statue's middle eye above that. There wasn't much of anything after that for the next 1,000 feet, until the base of the altar. "Now you can really be some help," she told him. "Hold on to my wrist and let me down. I'll get the jewel." They grabbed wrists, and Snake's 3 other hands, as well as the joints of his knees, locked around the base of 5 pipes that sprouted around them. Slowly she slid forward, until her free hand slipped on the stone and she dropped the length of their 2 arms and swung just above the statue's nose. The eye opened in front of her. The lid arced above her, and the white of either side of the ebony iris shone faintly in the half darkness. At the center of the iris, in a small hollow, sitting on the top of a metal support, was the jewel. She reached her free hand toward it as she swung. From somewhere a gong suddenly sounded. Light flooded over her. Looking up, She saw white sockets of light shining down into her own eyes. Panicking, she almost released Snake's wrist, but a voice in her head, hers or someone else's, she couldn't tell, rang out, "Hold on, damn it!" Then she grabbed the jewel. The metal shaft in which the jewel had stood was not steady, and tilted as her hand came away from it. The tilting must have set off some clockwork mechanism, because the great eyelid was slowly lowering over the ivory and ebony eye. She swung again at the end of the rope of bone and flesh. Half blinded by the lights above her, she looked over her shoulder into the temple below. There was singing, the beginning of a processional hymn. The morning rites had started. Light glinted on the stone limbs of the god. Figures were pouring into the temple. They must have seen her, but the hymn, sonorous and gigantic, rose like flood water, and she suddenly thought that if she fell she would drown in the sound of it. Snake was pulling her up, stone against her arm, against her cheek. She clenched her other fist tightly at her side. Another hand came down and helped pull her. Then another. Then she was lying among the metal pipes, and he was loosening her fingers from his wrist. He tugged her to her feet, and for a moment she was looking out over the now filled temple. Nervous energy contracted coldly along her body, and the sudden sight of the great drop filled her eyes and her head, and she staggered. Snake caught her, and at last helped her back to the ladder. "We've got it," she said to him before they started down. She breathed deeply. Then she checked in her palm to see if it was still there. It was, and again she looked out over the people below. Light on the upturned faces made them look like scattered pearls on the dark floor. An exultation suddenly burst in her shoulders, flooded her legs and arms, and for a moment washed the pain away. Snake, with one hand on her shoulder, was grinning also. "We've got it," she said again. They went down the ladder into the statue's skull. Snake preceded her out the hollow ear. He reached around, caught the cord, and let himself down to the shoulder. She hesitated for a moment, then put the jewel in her mouth and followed him. Standing beside him once more, she removed it, and then rubbed her shoulders. "Boy, am I going to have some Charley horse by tomorrow," she said. "Do me a favor and untie my bag for me." Snake untied the parcel from the end of the cord, and together now they climbed down the bicep and back over the forearm to the trap door in the wrist. She glanced down at the faces of the worshippers just before they disappeared into the tunnel. Snake was taking the jewel from her hand. She let him have it, and watched him raise it up above his head. Immediately, when he raised the jewel, the pearls of faces went out like extinguished flames as heads bent all through the temple. "That's the ticket," grinned Argo. "Come on." But Snake did not go into the tunnel. Instead, he walked around the fist, took hold of one of the bronze wheat stems, and slid down through an opening between the thumb and forefinger. "That way?" asked Argo. "Oh, well, I guess so. You know, I'm going to write an epic about this." But Snake had already gone. She followed him, clutching her feet around a great bunch of stems. He was waiting for her at the plateau of leaves. And nestled there, they gazed out once more at the fascinated congregation. Again Snake held aloft the jewel, and again heads bowed. The hymn began to repeat itself, the individual words lost in the sonority of the hall. They started down the last length of stems now, coming quickly. When they stood at last on the base, she put her hand on his shoulder and looked across the brass altar rail. The congregation pressed close, although she did not recognize an individual face. Yet a mass of people stood there, enormous and familiar. As Snake started forward, holding up the jewel, the people fell back from the rail. Snake climbed over the altar rail, and then helped her over. Her shoulders were beginning to hurt now, and the enormity of the theft ran chills up and down her spine. The black marble altar step, as she put her foot down, was awfully cold. They started forward again, and the last note of the hymn echoed to silence, filling the hall with the roaring quiet of the hushed breathing of hundreds. Simultaneously, both she and Snake got the urge to look back at the great diminishing height of Hama behind them. All three eyes were shut firmly now. A quiet composed of the rustling of 100 dark robes upon another 100 hissed about them as they started forward again. There was a spotlight on them, she suddenly realized. That was why the people, hovering back from the circular effulgence over the floor around them, seemed so dim. Her heart had become a pulse at the bottom of her tongue. They kept on going forward, into the shadowed faces, into the parting sea of dark cloaks and hoods. Then the last of the figures stepped aside from the temple door, and she could see the sunlight out in the garden. They stood still for a moment, Snake holding high the jewel. Then they burst forward, out through the door and down over the bright steps. Instantly the hymn began again behind them, as if their departure had been a signal. The music flooded after them, and when they reached the bottom step they both whirled, crouching like animals, expecting the congregation to come welling darkly out after them. But there was only the music, flowing into the light, washing around them. A transparent river, a sea. Freeze the drop in the hand, and break the earth with singing. Hail the height of a man, and also the height of a woman. Over the music came a brittle chirping from the trees. Fixed with fear, they watched the temple door as the hymn progressed. Then Snake suddenly stood up straight and grinned. She scratched her red hair, shifted her weight, and looked at Snake. "I guess they're not coming," she said, sounding almost disappointed. Then she giggled. "Well, I guess we got it."
Don't move, repeated Hama Incarnate. Now look, began Urson. You are perfectly safe, the god continued, unless you do anything foolish. You have shown great wisdom. Continue to show it. I have a lot to explain to you.
Like what? Asked Geo.
I'll start with the lizards, smiled the god.
The what? Asked Iimmi.
The singing lizards, said Hama. You walked through a grove of trees just a few minutes ago. You had just been through a series of happenings that was probably the most frightening in your life. Suddenly you heard a singing in the trees. What was it?
I thought it was a bird, Iimmi said. But why a bird? Asked the god.
Because that's what a bird sounds like, stated Urson impatiently. Who needs an old lizard singing to them on a morning like this?
Your second point is much better than your first, said the god. You do not need a lizard, but you did need a bird. A bird means spring, life, good luck, cheerfulness. You think of a bird singing, and you think of thoughts that men have been thinking for thousands upon thousands of years. Poets have written of it in every language. Catullus in Latin, Keats in English, Li Po in Chinese, Darnell X24 in New English. You expected a bird because after what you had been through, you needed to hear a bird. Lizards run from under wet rocks, scurry over gravestones. A lizard is not what you needed.
So what do lizards have to do with why we're here? Demanded Urson.
Why are you here? Repeated the god, subtly changing Urson's question. There are many reasons, I am sure. You tell me some of them. You have done wrongs to Argo, at least to Argo of Leptar, Geo explained. We have come to undo them. You have kidnapped the young Argo as well as her mother, apparently. We have come to take her back. You have misused the jewels. We have come to take the last one from you." Hama smiled. "Only a poet could see the wisdom in such honesty. I thought I might have to wheedle to get that much out of you." "I guess it was pretty certain that you knew that much already," Geo said. "True," answered Hama. Then his tone changed. "Do you know how the jewels work?" They shook their heads. "They are basically very simple mechanical contrivances which are difficult in execution, but simple in concept. I will explain. Human thoughts, it was discovered after the Great Fire during the first glorious years of the City of New Hope, did not produce waves similar to radio waves, but the electrical synapse pattern, it was found, can be read by radio waves, in the same way a mine detector reads the existence of metal." "Radio?" Geo said. "That's right," Hama said. "Oh, I forgot you don't know anything about that at all. Well, I can't go through the whole thing now. Suffice it to say that each of the jewels contains a carefully honed crystal, which is constantly sending out beams which can read these thought patterns. Also, the crystal acts like a magnifying glass or a mirror, and reflects and magnifies the energy from the brain into heat or light or any other kind of electromagnetic radiation. There I go again. So that you can send great bolts of heat with them, as you have seen done. But the actual workings of them are not important, and their ability to send heat out is only their secondary power. Their primary importance is that they can be used to penetrate the mind. Now we come to the lizards." "Wait a minute," Geo said. "Before we get to the lizards, do you mean go into minds like Snake does?" Suddenly he remembered that the boy was not there. But the god went on. "Like Snake," he said, "but different. Snake was born with the ability to transmute the brain patterns of his thoughts to others. In that he has a power something like the jewels, but nowhere as strong. But with the jewels, you can jam a person's thoughts." "Just go into his mind and stop him from thinking?" asked Iimmi. "No," said the god. "Conscious thought is too powerful. Otherwise, you would stop thinking every time Snake spoke to you. It works another way. How many reasons does a man have for any single action?" They looked at him uncomprehendingly. "Why, for example, does a man pull his hand from a fire?" "Because it hurts," said Urson. "Why else?" "Yes, why else?" asked Hama. "I think I see what you mean," said Iimmi. "He also pulls it out because he knows that outside the fire his hand isn't going to hurt. Like the bird, I mean the lizard. One reason we reacted like we did was because it sounded like a bird. The other reason was because we wanted to hear a bird just then. The man pulls his hand out because the fire hurts, and because he wants it not to hurt." "In other words," Geo summarized, "there are at least two reasons for everything." "Exactly," explained Hama. "And notice that one of these reasons is unconscious. But with the jewel you can jam the unconscious reason. So that if a man has his hand in a fire, you can jam his unconscious reason of wanting it to stop hurting. Completely bewildered and in no less pain, he will stand there until his wrist is a smoking nub." Geo reached over and felt his severed arm. "Dictators, during the entire history of this planet, have used similar techniques. By not letting the people of their country know what conditions existed outside their boundaries, they could get the people to fight to stay in those conditions. It was the old adage. Convince a slave that he's free, and he will fight to maintain his slavery. Why does a poet sing? Because he likes music, because silence frightens him. Why does a thief steal? To get the goods from his victim, also to prove that his victim cannot get him. That's how Argo got Snake back, Geo said to Urson. I see now. He was just thinking of running away, and she jammed his desire not to get caught. So he had nothing to direct him in which direction to run. So he ran where she told him, straight back to her. That's right, Hama said. But something else was learned when these jewels were invented. Or rather, a lesson which history should have taught us thousands of years ago was finally driven home. No man can wield absolute power over other men and still retain his own mind. For no matter how good his intentions are when he takes up the power, his alternate reason is that freedom, the freedom of the people, and ultimately his own, terrifies him. Only a man afraid of freedom would want this power, would conceive of wielding it. And that fear of freedom will turn him into a slave of this power. For this reason, the jewels are evil. That is why we have summoned you to steal them from us. To steal them from you? Asked Geo. Why couldn't you have simply destroyed them when you had them? We have already been infected, smiled the god. We are a small band here on Aptor. To reach the state of organization to collect the scattered scientific knowledge of the times before the Great Fire was not easy. Too often the jewels have been used and abused, and now we cannot destroy it. We would have to destroy ourselves first. We kidnapped Argo and left you the second jewel, hoping that you would come after the third and last one. Now you have come, and now the jewel is being stolen. Snake? Asked Geo. That's right, replied Hama. But I thought he was your spy, Geo said. That he is our spy is his unconscious reason for his actions, explained Hama. He is aware only that he is working against the evil he had seen in Jordde. Spy is too harsh a word for him. Say, rather, little thief. He became a spy for us quite unwittingly when he was on the island as a child with Jordde. I have explained something to you of how the mind works. We have machines that can duplicate what Snake does, in a similar way that the jewels work. This is how the blind priestesses contacted Jordde and made him their spy. This is how we reached Snake. But he never saw us, never even really talked to us. It was mainly because of something he saw when he first got here. Wait a minute, Iimmi said. Jordde wanted to kill me, and did kill Whitey because of something we might have seen. I bet this was the same thing. Now, what was it? Hama smiled. My telling you would do no good. Perhaps you can find out from Snake, or my daughter, Argo Incarnate. But what do we do now? Geo interrupted. Take the jewels back to Argo? Argo on the ship? She's already used the jewels to control minds, at least Snake's, so that means she's infected too. Once you guessed the reason for her infection, said Hama. We have been watching you on our screens since you landed. Do you remember what the reason was? Do you mean her being jealous of her sister? Geo asked. Yes. On one side her motives were truly patriotic for Leptar. On the other, they were selfish ones of power seeking. But without the selfish ones, she would have never gotten so far as she did. You must bring young Argo back, and give the infection a chance to work itself out. But what about the jewels? Asked Geo. All three of them will be together. Isn't that a huge temptation? Someone must meet this temptation and overcome it, said Hama. You do not know how much danger they are in while they are here on Aptor. Even if the final danger is only delayed, that delay will make it safer to bring them to Leptar. Suddenly, Hama turned to the screens and pushed a switch to on position. The opaque glass was filled with a picture of the interior of the temple. On the huge statue, a spotlight was following two microscopic figures over the statue's shoulder. They were climbing over the statue's elbow. Hama increased the size. It was two people, not bugs, climbing down the gigantic sculptured figure. They made their way along the statue's forearm now, to the golden stalks of wheat in the god's black fist. One and then the other began to shimmy down the stems. They arrived at the base and climbed over the rail. The screen enlarged again. "It's Snake," said Geo. "And he's got the jewel," Urson added. "That's Argo with him," Iimmi put in. "I mean, one of the Argos." They clustered around the screen, watching the congregation give way before the two fearful children. The red-haired girl in the short white tunic was holding onto Snake's shoulder. Suddenly Hama turned the picture off, and they looked away from the screen now, puzzled. "So you see," said the god, "the jewel has already been stolen. For the sake of Argo, and of Hama, carry the jewels back to Leptar. Young Argo will help you. Though her mother and I are pained to see her go, she is as prepared for the journey as you are, if not more. Will you do it?" "I will," Iimmi said. "Me too," said Geo. "I guess so," Urson said. "Good," smiled Hama. "Then come with me." He turned from the screen and walked through the door. They followed him down the long stairway, past the stone walls, into the hall and along the back of the church. He walked slowly and smiled like a man who had waited long for something finally arrived. They turned out of the temple and descended the bright steps. "I wonder where the kids are?" Urson asked. But Hama led them on, across the broad garden to where the great black urns sat in a row close to a wall of shrubbery. A woman, old Argo, suddenly joined them. She had apparently been waiting for them. She gave them a silent smile of recognition, and they continued across the garden path. Light fell through the shrubbery across her white tunic and Snake's bare back as they crouched over the contraption of coils and metal. She twisted two pieces of wire together in a final connection as Snake placed the jewel on an improvised thermocouple. Then they bent over it and both concentrated their thoughts on the bead. The thermocouple glowed red and electricity jumped in the copper veins, turning the metal bone into a magnet. The armature tugged once around its pivot, and then tugged around once more. Finally it was whipping around steadily, the brushes on its shaft reversing the magnetic poles with each half circle of the arc. It gained speed until it whirred into an invisible copper haze between them. "Hey," she breathed. "Look at it go, will you? Just look at it go." And the young thieves crouched over the humming motor, oblivious to the eyes of the elder gods that smiled at them from the edge of the green shift of shadow and sunlight by the side of the marble urn. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of The Jewels of Aptor by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 11. Under the trees, she raised up on tiptoe and kissed the balding forehead of a tall, dark-robed priest. "Dunderhead," she said, "I think you're cute." Then she blinked very rapidly and knuckled beneath her eye. "Oh," she added, remembering, "I was making yogurt in the biology laboratory yesterday. There's 2 gallons of it
fermenting under the tarantula cage. Remember to take it out. And take care of the hamsters. Please don't forget the hamsters." Finally, they started once more around the slope of the volcano, and the temple and grove fell black and green away behind them. "2 days to get to the ship," said Geo, squinting at the pale sky. "Perhaps we had better put the jewels together," said Urson. "Keep them out of harm's way, since we know their power." "What do you mean?" Iimmi asked. Urson took Geo's leather purse from his belt. Then he took the jewel from Geo's neck and dropped it in the purse. Then he held the purse out for Iimmi to do the same. "I guess it can't hurt," Iimmi said, dropping his chain into the pouch. "Here's mine too," Argo said. Urson pulled the purse string closed and tucked the pouch in at his waist. "Well," said Geo, "I guess we head for the river, so we can get back to your sister and Jordde." "Jordde?" asked Argo. "Who's he?" "He's a spy for the blind priestesses. He's also the one who cut Snake's tongue out." "Cut his?" Suddenly she stopped. "That's right. 4 arms. His tongue. I remember now. In the film." "In the what?" asked Iimmi. "What do you remember?" Argo turned to Snake. "I remember where I saw you before."
"You know Snake?" Urson asked.
"No, I never met him. But about a month ago, I saw a movie of what happened. It was horrible what they did to him."
"What's a movie?" asked Iimmi.
"Huh?" said Argo. "Oh, it's sort of like the vision screens, only you can see things that happened in the past. Anyway, Dunderhead showed me this film about a month ago. Then he took me down to the beach and said I should have seen something there, because of what I'd learned."
See something? Iimmi almost yelled. What was it?
He took her shoulder and shook it.
What was it you were supposed to see?
"Why?" began the girl, startled.
Because a friend of mine was murdered, and I almost was too, because of something we saw on that beach. Only I don't know what it was."
"But," began Argo, "but I don't either. I couldn't see it, so Dunderhead took me back to the temple." "Snake," Geo asked, "do you know what they were supposed to see? Or why Argo was taken to see it after she was shown what happened to you?" The boy shrugged. Iimmi turned on Snake.
Do you know, or are you just not telling? Come on now. That's the only reason I stuck with this so far, and I want to know what's going on."
Snake shook his head.
"I want to know why I was nearly killed," shouted the Negro. "You know, and I want you to tell me."
Iimmi raised his hand. Snake screamed. The sound tore over the distended vocal cords. Then he whirled and ran. Urson caught him and brought the boy crashing down among leaves.
"No, you don't," the giant growled. "You're not going to get away from me this time. You won't get away from me again."
"Watch it," said Argo. "You're hurting him. Urson, let go."
"Hey, ease up," said Iimmi. "Snake, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell. But I do want you to tell me, very much."
Urson let the boy up, still mumbling.
"Well, he's not going to get away again."
"When did he get away from you the first time?" Geo said, coming over to the boy. "Let him go. Look, Snake, do you know what there was about the beach that was so important?" Snake nodded. "Can you tell?" Now the boy shook his head and glanced at Urson. "You don't have to be afraid of him," Geo said, puzzled. "Urson won't hurt you." But Snake shook his head again. "Well," said Geo, "we can't make you. Let's get going."
I bet I could make him, the giant mumbled.
No, said Argo, I don't think you could. I watched the last time somebody tried, and I don't think you could. Late morning flopped over hotly in the sky and turned into afternoon. The jungle became damp, and bright insects plunged like tiny knives of blue or scarlet through leaves. Wet foliage brushed against their chests, faces and shoulders. Why would they show you a film of something awful before taking you to the beach? Yimmy asked. Maybe it was supposed to have made me more receptive to what we saw, said Argo. If horror makes you receptive to whatever it was, said Yimmy, I should have been about as receptive as possible. What do you mean? Asked Geo. I just watched 10 guys get hacked to pieces all over the sand, remember? They walked silently for a time. We'll come out at the head of the river. It's a huge marsh that drains off into the main channel, said Argo presently. Late afternoon darkened quickly. I was wondering about something, Geo said after a little while. What? Asked Argo. Hama said that once the jewels had been used to control minds, the person who used them was infected. Rather, the infection was already there, corrected Argo. That just brought it out. Yes, said Geo. Anyway, Hama also said that he was infected. When did he have to use the jewels? Lots of times, Argo said. Too many. The last time was when I was kidnapped. He used the jewel to control pieces of that thing you all killed in the city of New Hope to come and kidnap me and then leave the jewel in Leptar. A piece of that monster? Geo exclaimed. No wonder it decayed so rapidly when it was killed. Huh? Asked Yimmy. Argo, I mean your sister, told me they had managed to kill one of the kidnappers, and it melted the moment it died. We couldn't control the whole mass, she explained. It really doesn't have a mind. But like everything alive, it has, or had, the double impulse. But what did kidnapping you accomplish anyway? Yimmy asked. Argo grinned. It brought you here, and now you're taking the jewels away. Is that all? Asked Yimmy. Well, said Argo, isn't that enough? She paused for an instant. You know, I wrote a poem about all this once, the double impulse and everything. Geo recited. By the dark chamber sits its twin, where the body's floods begin, and the two are twinned again, turning out and turning in. How did you know? She asked. The dark chamber is Hama's temple, Geo said. Am I right? And its twin is Argo's, she went on. They should be twins, really. And then the twins again are the children. The force of age in each one opposed to the young force. See? I see, Geo smiled. And the body's floods, turning in and out? That's sort of everything man does. His going and coming, his great ideas, his achievements, his little ideas too. It all comes from the interplay of those four forces. Four, said Urson. I thought it was just two. But it's thousands, Argo explained. The air was drenching. The leaves had been shiny before. Now they dripped water on the loose ground. Pale light lapsed through the branches, shimmered, reflected from leaf to the wet underside of leaf. The ground became mud. Twice they heard a sloshing a few feet away, and then the scuttling of an unseen animal. I hope I don't step on something that decides to take a chunk of my foot. I'm pretty good at first aid, Argo said. It's getting chilly, she added.
Just then Geo slipped and sank knee deep in a muddy pool. Urson raced to the edge of the quicksand bog and grabbed Geo by his good arm. He pulled till Geo emerged, coated to the thigh with gray mud.
You all right? Urson asked. You sure you're all right?
Geo nodded, rubbing the stump of his arm with his good hand. "I'm all right," he said. The trees had almost completely given out. Geo suddenly saw the whole swamp sinking in front of him. He splashed a step backwards, but Urson caught his shoulder. The swamp wasn't sinking, though, but ripples had begun to appear over the water, spreading, crossing, webbing the whole surface with a net of tiny waves. Then they began to rise up. Green backs broke the surface, wet and slippery. They were standing now, torrents cascading their green faces, green chests. 3 of them, now a 4th, 4 more, and then many more. They stood now, these naked, green, mottled bodies. Geo felt a sudden tugging in his head, at his mind. Looking around, he saw that the others felt it too.
Them?
Urson started. "They're the ones who carried us," Geo began. The tug came again, and they stepped forward. Iimmi put his hand on his head. "They want us to go with them." And suddenly they were going forward, slipping into the familiar state of half consciousness which had come when they had crossed the river to the City of New Hope, or when they had first fallen into the sea. Wet hands fell on their bodies as they were guided through the swamp. They were carried through deeper water. Now they were walking over dry land where the vegetation was thicker, and slimy boulders caught shards of sunset on their wet flanks, blood leaking on the gray, the wet gray, and the green. Through a rip in the arras of vegetation, they saw the moon push through the clouds, staining them silver. A rock rose in silhouette against the moon. On the rock a naked man stood, staring at the white disk. White highlighted one side of his body. As they passed, he howled, or anyway, opened his mouth and threw his head back, but their ears were full of night and could not hear, and dropped to all fours. A breeze blew momentarily in the sudden plume of his tail, in the scraggly hair of the underbelly, and light lay white on the points of his ears, his lengthened muzzle, his thinned hind legs. The animal turned its head once, and then scampered down the rock and into the darkness as a curtain of trees swung across the open sky. Eyes of flame whipped ahead of them as water swirled their knees once more. Then the water went down and sand washed back under the soles of their feet on the dark beach. The beating of the sea, the rush of the river, and the odor of the wet leaves that fingered their cheeks, prodded their shins, and slapped against their bellies as they moved forward, all this fell away. Red eyes wavered into flaming tongues, and the tongues showed themselves housed in the mouths of a dozen caves. Light flickered on the wet rocks, and they entered the largest one. Their eyes suddenly focused once more. Foam washed back and forth over the sand floor, and black chains of weeds, caught in crevices on the rock, lengthened over the sand with the inrush of water. Webbed hands released them. Brown rocks rose around in the firelight. They raised their eyes to where the Old One sat. The long spines were strung with shrunken membrane. His eyes, gray and indistinct, were close to the surface of his broad nostriled face. A film of water trickled over the rock where he sat. Others stood about him, on various levels of the rock. The tugging left them, and they glanced at one another now. Outside the cave it was raining hard. Geo saw that Argo's hair had wet to dark auburn and hugged her head now, making little streaks down her neck. Suddenly a voice boomed at them like an echo.
more than the reverberation that the cave would give. "Carriers of the jewels," it began, and suddenly Geo realized that it was the same hollowness that accompanied Snake's soundless messages. "We have brought you here to give a warning. We are the oldest forms of intelligence on this planet," continued the Old One from the throne. "We have watched from the delta of the Nile the rise of the pyramids. We have seen the murder of Caesar from the banks of the Tiber. We watched the Spanish Armada destroyed by English, and we followed man's great metal fish through the ocean before the Great Fire. We have never aligned ourselves with either Argo or Hama, but rise in the sexless swell of the ocean. We can warn you, as we have warned man before. As before, some will listen, some will not. Your minds are your own now. That I pledge you. Now, I warn you, cast the jewels into the sea. Nothing is ever lost in the sea, and when the evil has been washed from them with time and brine, they will be returned to man. For then time and brine will have washed away his imperfections also. No living intelligence is free from their infection, nothing with the double impulse of life. But we are old, and can hold them for 1,000,000 years before we will be so infected as you are. Your young race is too condensed in its living to tolerate such power at its fingers now. Again I say, cast these into the sea. The knowledge which man needs to alleviate hunger and pain from the world of men is contained in 2 monasteries on this island. Both have the science to put the jewels to use, to the good use which is possible with them. Both have been infected. In Leptar, however, where you carry these jewels, there is no way at all to utilize them for anything but evil. There will only be the temptation to destroy." "What about me?" Argo suddenly piped up. "I can teach them all sorts of things in Leptar." She took one of Snake's hands. "We used one for our motor." "You will find something else to make your motor turn," came the voice. "You still have to see something that you have not yet seen?" "At the beach?" demanded Iimmi. "Yes," nodded the Old One, with something like a sigh. "At the beach. We have a science that allows us to do things which to you seem impossibilities, as when we carried you in the sea for weeks without your body decaying. We can enter your mind as Snake does, and we can do much else. We have a wisdom which far surpasses even Argo's and Hama's on Aptor. Will you then cast the jewels into the sea and trust them with us?" Here Urson interrupted. "How can we give you the jewels?" he said. "How can we be sure you're not going to use them against Argo and Hama once you get them? You say nobody is impervious to them, and we've only got your say-so on how long it would take you to fall victim. You can already influence minds. That's how you got us here. And according to Hama, that's what corrupts. And you've already done it." "Besides," Geo said, "there's something else. We've nearly messed this thing up a dozen times trying to figure out motives and countermotives, and it always comes back to the same thing. We've got a job to do, and we ought to do it. We're supposed to return Argo and the jewels to the ship, and that's what we're doing." "He's right," said Iimmi. "It's the general rule again. Act on the simplest theory that holds all the information." The Old One sighed again. "Once, 1,500 years ago, a man who was to maneuver one of the metal birds walked and pondered by the sea. He had been given a job to do. We tried to warn him, as we tried to warn you. but he jammed his hands into the pockets of his khaki uniform and uttered to the waves the words you just uttered, and the warning was shut out of his mind. He scrambled up over the dunes on the beach, never taking his hands out of his pockets. The next morning, at 5 o'clock, when the sun slanted red across the airfield, he climbed into his metal bird, took off, flew for some time over the sea, looking down on the water like crinkled foil under the heightening sun, until he reached land again. Then he did his job. He pressed a button which released 2 shards of fire metal in a housing of cobalt. The land flamed, the sea boiled in the harbors, and 2 weeks later he was also dead. That which burned your arm away, poet, burned away his whole face, boiled his lungs in his chest, and his brain in his skull. There was a pause, and then, yes, we can control minds. We could have relieved the tiredness, immobilized the fear, the terror, immobilized all his unconscious reasons for doing what he did, just as a man can now do with the jewels. But had we would have also immobilized the honor which he clung to. Yes, we can control minds, but we do not. Now the voice swelled. But never, since that day on the shore before the great fire, has the temptation to do so been as great as now. Again the voice returned to normal. Perhaps, and there was almost humor in it now, the temptation is too great, even for us. Perhaps we have reached the place where the jewels would push us just across the line where we have never before gone, make us do those things that we have never done. You have heard our warning now. The choice, I swear to you, is yours. They stood silent in the high cave, the fire on their faces weaving brightness and shadow. Geo turned to look at the rain-blurred darkness outside the cave's entrance. Out there is the sea, said the voice again. Your decision, quickly. The tide is coming in. It was snatched from their minds before they could articulate it. 2 children saw a bright motor turning in the shadow. Geo and Iimmi saw the temples of Argo and Leptar. Then there was something darker, and for a moment they all saw all the pictures at once. A wave splashed across the floor, like twisted glass before the rock on which the fire stood. Then it flopped wetly across the burning driftwood, which hissed into darkness. Charred sticks turned, glowing in the water, and were extinguished. Rain was buffeting them. Hands held them once more, pulling them into the warm sea, the darkness, and then nothing. Snake was thinking again, and this time through the captain's eyes. The cabin door burst open in the rain. Wind whipped her wet veils about her in the door as lightning made them transparent, blackening her body's outline. Jordde rose from his seat. She closed the door on thunder. I have received the signal from the sea, she said. Tomorrow you pilot the ship into the estuary. The captain's voice. But Priestess Argo, I cannot take the ship into Aptor. We already have lost 10 men. I cannot sacrifice. In the storm, smiled Jordde. If it is like this tomorrow, how can I take her through the rocks? Her nostrils flared as her lips compressed to a chalky line. She was regarding Jordde. The captain's thoughts. What is between them, this confused tension? It upsets me deeply, and I am tired. You will pilot the boat to shore tomorrow, Argo nearly hissed. They have returned with the jewels. The captain's thoughts. They speak to each other in a code I don't understand. I am so tired now. I have to protect my ship, my men. That is my job.
my responsibility."
But Argo turned to the captain.
I hired you to obey me. I order you to pilot this ship to Aptor shore tomorrow morning.
The captain's thoughts. Yes, yes. The fatigue and the unknowing. But I must fulfill, must complete. "Jordde," he began. "Yes, captain," answered the mate, anticipating. "If the weather is permitting, sir, I will take the ship as close as I can get." He smiled now, a thin curve over his face, and turned toward Argo. End of chapter 11. Of The Jewels of Aptor by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 12. The roughness of sand beneath one of his sides, and the flare of the sun on the other. His eyes were hot and his lids were orange over them. He turned over and reached out to dig his fingers into the sand. Only one hand closed. Then he remembered. Opening his eyes, he rolled to his knees. The sand grated under his kneecaps. Looking out toward the water, he saw that the sun hung only seeming inches above the horizon. Then he saw the ship. From its course, he gathered it was heading toward the estuary of the river down the beach. He began to run toward where the rocks and vegetation cut off the end of the beach. The sand under his feet was cool. A moment later, he saw Iimmi's dark figure come from the jungle. He was heading for the same place. Geo hailed him, and, panting, they joined each other. Then, together, they continued toward the rocks. As they broke through the first sheet of foliage, they bumped into the red-haired girl who stood, knuckling her eyes, in the shadow of the broad palm fronds. When she recognized them, she joined them silently. Finally, they reached the outcropping of rock a few hundred feet up the river bank. The rain had swelled the river's mouth to tremendous violence. It vomited surges of brown water into the ocean, frothed against rocks, and boiled opaquely below them. It was nearly half again as wide as Geo remembered it. Although the sky was clear, beyond the brown bile of the river, the sea snarled viciously and bared white teeth in the sun. It took another 15 minutes for the boat to maneuver through the granite spikes toward the rocky embankment 100 yards away. Glancing down into the turbulence, Argo breathed, "Chee." But that was the only human sound against the water's roaring. The boat's prow doffed in the swell, and then at last her plank swung out and bumped unsteadily on the rocky bank. Figures were gathering on deck.
Hey,
Argo said, pointing toward one.
that's Sis. Where the hell are Snake and Urson?
Iimmi asked.
That's Snake down there,
Geo said.
look.
He pointed with his nub. They could see Snake crouched near the gangplank itself. He was behind a ledge of rock, invisible to the people on the ship, apparently, but plain to Geo and his companions. "Watch it," Geo said. "I'm going down there. You stay here." He ducked off through the vines, keeping in sight of the rock's edge and the boiling foam. The ship grew before him, and at last he reached a sheltered rise, just 10 feet above the nest of rock in which the four-armed boy was crouching. Geo looked out at the boat. Jordde stood at the head of the gangplank. The 18 feet of board was unsteady with the roll of the ship. Jordde held something like a black whip in his hand, only the end went to a box-like contraption strapped to his back. With a lash raised, he stepped onto the shifting plank. Geo wondered what the whip contrivance was. The answer came with a hollow sound of Snake's thoughts. "That is machine he used to cut tongue with, only on whip now, not wire. So Snake knew he was just behind him. As he was trying to figure exactly the implications of what Snake had said, suddenly, with the speed of a bird's shadow, Snake leapt from his hiding place and landed on the shore end of the plank. He recovered from his crouch and rushed down the plank toward Jordde, apparently intending to knock him from the board. Jordde raised the lash and it fell across the boy's shoulder. It didn't land hard. It just dropped. But Snake suddenly reeled and went down on one knee, grabbing the sides of the plank. Geo was close enough to hear the boy scream. "I cut your tongue out once with this thing," Jordde said, matter-of-factly. "Now I'm going to cut the rest of you to pieces." He adjusted a control at his belt and raised the lash again. Geo leapt for the plank. He faced Jordde over the crouching boy. He wondered how wise it had been. Then he had to stop wondering and try to duck the falling lash. He couldn't. It landed with only the weight of gravity, brushing his cheek, then dropping across his shoulder and down his back. He screamed. The whole side of his face seemed seared away, and an inch crevice burned into his shoulder and back the length it touched him. He bit into white fire, trying not to leap aside into the foaming chasm between rocks and boat. As the lash rasped over his shoulder, sweat flooded his eyes. His good arm, which held the edge of the plank, was shaking like a plucked string on a loose guitar. Snake lunged back against him, almost knocking him over. When Geo blinked the tears out of his eyes, he saw two bright welts over Snake's shoulder. He also saw that Jordde had stepped out upon the plank and was smiling. When the line fell again, he wasn't sure what happened. He leaned in one direction, and suddenly Snake was a dive of legs in the other. Now Snake was just 4 sets of fingers on the edge of the plank. Geo screamed again and shook. 2 sets of fingers disappeared from one side of the board and reappeared on the other. As Jordde raised the lash a 4th time to rid the plank of this last one-armed nuisance, the fingers worked rapidly forward toward Jordde's feet, until suddenly an arm raised from beneath the plank grabbed Jordde's foot and tugged. The lash fell far from Geo, who was still trembling, trying to move backwards off the unsteady plank and keep from vomiting at the same time. Jordde tripped, but turned in time to grab the edge of the ship's gate and steady himself. At the same time, one leg, and then another, came up the other side of the plank, and then Snake rolled into a crouching position on the board's top. Geo got his feet under him now and stumbled backwards, off the plank, and then sat down hard a few feet back on the rocks. He clutched his good arm across his stomach, and without lowering his eyes, leaned forward to cool his back. Jordde, half seated on the board now, lashed the whip sideways. Snake leapt a foot from the plank as the line swung beneath his feet. All 4 arms went spidering out to regain equilibrium. The whip struck the side of the boat, left a burn along the hull, and came swinging back again. Snake leapt once more and made it. Suddenly there was a shadow over him, and Geo saw Urson stride up to the end of the plank. His back to Geo, he crouched bear-like at the plank's head.
All right, now try someone a little bigger than you. Come on, kid, get off there. I want my turn."
Urson's sword was drawn. Snake turned, grabbed at something on Urson, but the big man knocked him away as he leapt diagonally onto the shore. Urson laughed over his shoulder.
"Huh, you don't want the ones around my neck," he called back. "Here, keep these for me."
He tossed the leather purse from his belt back to the shore. Snake landed just as Jordde flung the lash out again. Urson must have caught the line across his chest, because they saw his back suddenly stiffen. Then he leapt forward and came down with his sword so hard that had Jordde still been there, his leg would have come off.
Jordde leapt back onto the edge of the ship, and the sword sliced 3 inches into the plank. As Urson tried to pull the blade out once more, Jordde sent his whip singing again. It wrapped Urson's midsection like a black serpent, and didn't come loose. Urson howled. He flung his sword forward, which probably only by accident thwunked 17 inches through Jordde's abdomen. He bent forward, grabbed the line with both hands, and tugged backwards, screaming. Jordde took 2 steps onto the plank, his mouth open, his eyes closed, and fell over the side. Urson heaved backwards and toppled from the other side. For a moment they hung with the whip between them over the board. The ship heaved, rolled to. The plank swiveled, came loose, and with the board on top of them, they crashed into the water. Geo and Snake were at the rock's edge. Iimmi and Argo were coming up behind them. Below them, limbs and board bobbed through the foam once. The line had somehow looped around Urson's neck, and the plank had turned up almost on end. Then they went under again. With nothing between it and the rock wall of shore, the boat began to roll in. With each swell, it came in 6 feet, then leaned out 3. Then it came back another 6. It took 4 swells, the time of 4 very deep breaths, until the side of the boat was grating up against the rocks. Geo could hear the plank splintering down in the water, but the sound of the water blanketed anything else that was breaking down there. Geo took 2 steps backwards, clutched at his stubbed arm, and threw up. Somebody, the captain, was calling. "Get her away from the rocks! Away from the rocks, before she goes to pieces!" Iimmi took Geo's arm. "Come on, boy," he said, and managed to haul him onto the ship. Argo and Snake leapt on behind them, as the boat floundered away from the shore. Geo leaned against the rail. Below him the water turned on itself in the rocks, thrashed along the river's side, and then, as he raised his eyes, stretched out along the bright blade of the beach. The long sand that rimmed the island dropped away from them, a stately and austere arc, gathering in its curve all the sun's glare, and throwing it back on wave and on wave. His back hurt. His stomach was shriveled and shaken like an old man's palsied fist. His arm was gone, and Urson. And then Argo said, "Look at the beach!" Geo flung his eyes up and tried in one moment to envelop whatever he saw, whatever it would be. Beneath the roar was a tide of quiet. The sand along the naked crescent was dull at depressions, mirror bright at rises. At the jungle's edge, leaves and fronds sped multi-textured rippling along the foliage. Each single fragment in that green carpet, hung up in the sun, was one leaf, he reflected, with 2 sides, and an entire system of skeleton and veins, as his hand and arm had been. And maybe one day would drop off too. He looked from rock to rock now. Each was different, shaped and lined distinctly, but losing detail as the ship floated out, as the memory of his entire adventure was losing detail. That one there was like a bull's head half submerged. Those 2 flat ones together on the sand looked like the stretched wings of eagles. The waves, measured and magnificent, followed one another onto the sand, like the varying, never duplicated rhythm of a good poem, peaceful, ordered, and calm. He tried to pour the chaos of Urson, drowning, from his mind onto the water. It flowed into each glass green wave's trough in which it rode, suddenly quiet, up to the beach. He spread the pain in his own body over the web of foam and green shimmering, and was surprised because it fit easily, hung there well, quieted.
very much quieted. Somewhere at the foot of his brain an understanding was beginning to effloresce with the sea's water, under the sun. Geo turned away from the rail, and with the wet deck slipping under his bare feet, he walked toward the forecastle. He released his broken limb, and his hand hung at his side. When Snake came down that evening, Geo was lying on his back in the bunk, following the grain of the wood on the bottom of the bed above his. He had his good arm behind his neck now. Snake touched his shoulder. "What is it?" Geo asked, turning on his side and sitting out from under the bunk. Snake held out the leather purse to Geo. "Huh?" Geo asked. "Didn't you give them to Argo yet?" Snake nodded. "Well, why didn't you take them? Look, I don't want to see them again." Snake pushed the purse toward him again, and added, "Look." Geo took the purse, opened the drawstring, and turned the contents out in his hand. There were 3 chains, on each of which was a gold coin fastened by a hole near the edge. Geo frowned. "How come these are in here?" he asked. "I thought, where are the jewels?" "In ocean," Snake said. "Urson switched them." "What are you talking about?" demanded Geo. "What is? What is it?" "Don't want tell you." "I don't care what you want, you little thief." Geo grabbed him by his shoulder. "Tell me." "Knew from back with blind priestesses," Snake explained rapidly. "He asked me how to use jewels when you and Iimmi exploring, and after that no listen to thoughts, bad thoughts, bad." "But he," Geo started. "He saved your life." "But what is reason?" Snake said. "At end." "You saw his thoughts at the end?" asked Geo. "What did he think?" "You sleep, please," Snake said. "Lot of hate. Lot of bad hate." There was a pause in the voice in his head. "And love." Geo began to cry. A bubble of sound in the back of his throat burst, and he turned onto the pillow and tried to bite through the sound with his teeth. The tiredness, the fear, for Urson, for his arm, and the change which hurt. His whole body ached, his back hurt in 2 sharp lines, and he couldn't stop crying. Iimmi, who had now decided to take the bunk above Geo, came back a few minutes after mess. Geo had just awakened. Geo laughed. "I found out what it was we saw on the beach that made us so dangerous." "How?" asked Iimmi. "When? What was it?" "Same time you did," Geo said. "I just looked. And then Snake explained the details of it to me later." "When?" Iimmi repeated. "I just took a nap, and he went through the whole thing with me." "Then what was it you saw? We saw?" "Well, first of all, do you remember what Jordde was before he was shipwrecked on Aptor?" "Didn't Argo say he was studying to be a priest? Old Argo, I mean." "Right," said Geo. "Now, do you remember what my theory was about what we saw?" "Did you have a theory?" Iimmi asked. "About horror and pain making you receptive to whatever it was." "Oh, that," Iimmi said. "I remember. Yes." "I was also right about that. Now add to all this some theory from Hama's lecture on the double impulse of life. It wasn't a thing we saw. It was a situation, or rather an experience we had. Also, it didn't have to be on the beach. It could have happened anywhere. Man and his constantly diametric motivations is always trying to reconcile opposites. In fact, you can say that an action is a reconciliation of the duality of his motivation. Now, take all that we've been through, the confusion, the pain, the disorder, then reconcile that with the great order obvious in something like the sea, with its rhythm, its tides and waves, its overpowering calm, or the ordering of cells in a leaf, or a constellation of stars. If you can do it, something happens to you. You grow. You become a bigger person, able to understand or reconcile more. "All right," said Iimmi. And that's what we saw, or the experience we had when we looked at the beach from the ship this morning. Chaos caught in order, the order defining chaos. "All right again," Iimmi said. "And I'll even assume that Jordde knew that the two impulses of this experience were one, something terrible and confused, like seeing 10 men hacked to pieces by vampires, or seeing a film of a little boy getting his tongue pulled out, or coming through what we came through since we landed on Aptor. And two, something calm and ordered, like the beach and the sea. Now, why would he want to kill someone simply because they might have gone through what amounts, I guess, to the basic religious experience?" "You picked just the right word," Geo smiled. Now, Jordde was a novice in the not too liberal religion of Argo. Jordde and Snake had been through nearly as much on Aptor as we had, and they survived. And they also emerged from that jungle of horror onto that great arcing rhythm of waves and sand. And they went through just what you and I and Argo went through. Little Argo, I mean. And it was just at that point when the blind priestesses of Argo made contact with Jordde. They did so by means of those vision screens we saw them with, which can receive sound and pictures from just about any place, but can also project at least sound to just about anywhere too. In other words, right in the middle of this religious, or mystic, or whatever you want to call it, experience, a voice materialized out of thin air that claimed to be the voice of the goddess. Have you any idea what this did to his mind?" "I imagine it took all the real significance out of the whole thing," Iimmi said. "It would for me." "It did," said Geo. "Jordde wasn't what you'd call stable before that. If anything, this made him more so. It also stopped his mental functioning from working in the normal way. And Snake, who was reading his mind at the time, suddenly saw himself watching the terrifying sealing up process of an active and competent, if not healthy, mind. He saw it again in Urson. It's apparently a pretty stiff thing to watch. That's why he stopped reading Urson's thoughts. The idea of stealing the jewels for himself was slowly eating away Urson's balance. The understanding, the ability to reconcile disparities, like the incident with the blue lizard. Things like that, all of which were signs we didn't get. Snake contacted Hama by telepathy, almost accidentally, and Hama was something to hold on to for the boy. "Still, why did Jordde want to kill anybody who had experienced this, voice of God and all?" "Because Jordde had by now managed to do what a static mind always does. The situation, the beach, the whole thing suddenly meant for him the revelation of a concrete God. Now, he knew that Snake had contacted something also, something which the blind priestesses told him was thoroughly evil, an enemy, a devil. On the raft, on the boat, he religiously tried to convert Snake, till at last, in evangelical fury, he cut the boy's tongue out with the electric generator and the hot wire. which the blind priestesses had given him before he left. Why did he want to get rid of anybody who had seen his beach, a sacred place to him by now? One, because the devils were too strong and he didn't want anybody else possessed by them. Snake had been too much trouble resisting conversion. And two, because he was jealous that someone else might have that moment of exaltation and hear the voice of the goddess also. In other words, summarized Jimmy, he thought what happened to him and Snake was something supernatural, actually connected with the beach itself, and didn't want it to happen to anybody else. That's right, said Geo, lying back in his bunk. Which is sort of understandable. They didn't come in contact with any of the technology of Aptor, and so it might well have seemed that way. Iimmi leaned back also. Yeah, he said, I can see how the same thing almost might have happened to me, if everything had been the same. Geo closed his eyes. Snake came down and took the top bunk, and when he slept, Snake told him of Urson, of his last thoughts, and surprisingly, things he mostly knew. Emerging from the forecastle the next morning, he felt bright sunlight slice across his face. He had to squint, and when he did so, he saw her sitting cross-legged on the stretched canvas topping of a suspended lifeboat. Hi up there, he called. Hello, she called down. How are you feeling? Geo shrugged. Argo slipped her feet over the gunwale and with paper bag in hand, dropped to the deck. She bobbed up next to his shoulder, grinned, and said, Hey, come on back with me. I want to show you something. Sure, he followed her. Suddenly, she looked serious. Your arm is worrying you. Why? Geo shrugged. You don't feel like a whole person. I guess you're not really a whole person. Don't be silly, said Argo. Besides, maybe Snake will let you have one of his. How are the medical facilities in Leptar? I don't think they're up to anything like that. We did grafting of limbs back in Aptor, Argo said. A most interesting way we got around the antibody problem, too. You see. But that was back in Aptor, Geo said. This is the real world we're going into now. Maybe I can get a doctor from the temple to come over, she shrugged. And then maybe I won't be able to. It's a pleasant thought, Geo said. When they reached the back of the ship, Argo took out a contraption from the paper bag. I salvaged this in my tunic. Hope it dried off well enough last night. It's your motor, Geo said. Mm-hmm, said Argo. She put it on a low set of lockers by the cabin's back wall. How are you going to work it? He asked. It's got to have that stuff, electricity. There is more than one way to shoe a centipede, Argo assured him. She reached behind the locker and pulled up a strange gizmo of glass and wire. I got the lens from Sis, she explained. She's awfully nice, really. She says I can have my own laboratory all to myself. And I said she could have all the politics, which I think was wise of me, considering. Don't you? She bent over the contraption. Now, this lens here focuses the sunlight. Isn't it a beautiful day? On these thermocouples. I got the extra metal from the ship's smith. He's sweet. Hey, we're going to have to compare poems from now on. I mean, I'm sure you're going to write a whole handful about all of this. I certainly am. Anyway, you connect it up here. She fastened two wires to two other wires, adjusted the lens, and the tips of the thermocouple glowed red. The armature tugged once around its pivot, and then tugged around once more. Geo glanced up and saw Snake and Iimmi standing above them, looking over the rail on the cabin's roof. They grinned at each other, and then Geo looked back at the motor. It whipped around steadily, gaining speed until it whirred into an invisible copper haze. "Look at that thing go," breathed Argo. "Will you just look at that thing go." End of chapter 12. End of The Jewels of Aptor by Samuel R. Delany.